Millions of Americans have been personally feeling the impact of this economic downturn. And today we learned that the U.S. economy as a whole, measured by real GDP, contracted a record-shattering 32.9% last quarter. To break all
the United States economy has recently seen the sharpest and steepest decline in history. The gross domestic product, which is the broadest measure of economic activity, has shrank at an annual rate of 32.9% in the second quarter as restaurants and retailers close their doors in a desperate effort to slow the spread of the virus, which has killed more than 150,000 people in the U.S. The economic shock in April, May, and June was more than 3 times as sharp as the previous record, 10% in 1958, and nearly 4 times the worst quarter during the Great Recession. It's fair to say the economy of the United States is now looking more uncertain than ever. Another 1.43 million people filed for state unemployment last week, an increase of 12,000. It was the second week in a row of increased unemployment filings and shows that the economic picture continues to remain grim. The report comes amid a recession that began in February and pulled first quarter growth down 5%. On a quarterly basis, the Q2 decline was 1.8%. Sharp contractions in personal consumption, exports, inventories, investment, and spending by state and local governments converged to bring down GDP, which is the combined tally of all goods and services produced during the period. Personal consumption, which historically has accounted for about 2/3 of all activity in the U.S., subtracted 25% from the Q2 total, with services accounting for nearly all that drop. What makes this more alarming is the fact that neither the Great Depression nor the Great Recession nor any of the more than 36 economic slumps over the past 2 centuries have ever caused such a sharp drain over so short a period of time. By comparison, the worst quarter during the financial crisis of 2008 was the 8.4% GDP drop in the fourth quarter of that year. The previous low watermark was a 10% slide in the first quarter of 1958, while the worst in recorded history came in Q2 of 1921. This particular economic uncertainty will continue to carry until the pandemic is over and a vaccine that's reliable is found, which is widely seen as the main engine of the economy, contracted by a record 34.6% annualized in the spring. The decline was especially sharp within services including the travel, tourism, medical care, eating out, and the like, with many companies going out of business that rely on large groups of consumers and heavy store traffic bore the brunt of government lockdowns after the pandemic erupted. Spending on services nosedived at a 43.5% annual pace. Households also spent far less on goods, though the decline wasn't quite as steep. Purchases dropped 11.3%. Americans bought more cars, groceries, and certain other household staples, with many working from home, but sales of clothing, gasoline, and many other goods all fell sharply. Despite all this, however, the United States stock market has begun surging to all-time highs, with the Nasdaq, which is mainly made of tech companies, has recently continued to hit record highs, and this has been the case for the markets, which have bottomed in late March and since are up more than 40%. The U.S. economy is facing one of its most uncertain moments ever as the deadly virus remains a constant threat. According to Pew Research, people are growing more pessimistic about how America's leaders have handled the virus and the nation's ability to contain it, which only digs a deeper hole for the economy. As soon as the virus flares in a part of the country, cell phone data shows people immediately stay home instead of venturing out to restaurants, stores, and entertainment. And this is inevitably going to have a consequence to the business owners who see far less customers than usual, to the point where the expenses of running the business outweigh the revenues and profits. In other words, just simply not being worth keeping the business running. Businesses are now living in fear that they will be shut down again or customers won't return. Managers are struggling to keep the changing safety guidelines. School districts are grappling with whether to reopen this fall or if they'll be able to stay open. Parents are straining to juggle full-time jobs with kids at home. And supply chains are showing worrying signs of shortages again. For many, there's a growing sense it's a lost year. The U.S.'s huge debt and expanding stock market bubbles have damaged the confidence of global investors. In order to tackle the fallout of the pandemic, the U.S. government has launched massive stimulus packages, and the U.S. Federal Reserve has pledged unlimited quantitative easing, drastically accelerating the U.S.'s deficit. The massive QE could ease a liquidity crisis and pressure on small businesses in the short term. However, it won't boost the economy's internal growth. Instead, it could create further risks in financial markets, and this is what's frightening a lot of people right now. Whether the economic recovery will actually be natural and be driven by consumer spending, or will it actually be driven by massive economic stimulus packages through QE, which will undoubtedly have consequences in the long term? If 2020 had to be condensed into a single word, it would be uncertainty. And there are many, many words to describe it. Uncertainty would hover at the top of the list. Uncertainty about health, about the future, about the country itself. And uncertainty about livelihoods and jobs and economic security in a historical moment where each day seems to bring a fresh wave of unwanted developments. America has faced economic calamity before, most recently during the recession of 2008 when the jobless rate soared to 10%. That pales in comparison to the two crises that have cost more than 160,000 American lives and ushered in spiraling unemployment. 30 million job losses, of which 17.5 people remain unemployed. In recent congressional testimony, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell repeated his earlier warning. The strength of any recovery will rely on the nation's ability to contain the virus. The outlook for the U.S. economy, he said, is extraordinarily uncertain. Nearly 20 million Americans were on the unemployment line. About half those jobs have been recovered since then. According to the non-farm payrolls report Friday that showed the unemployment rate stood at 10.1%, 5 months after hitting a 50-year low. Because of this, an unemployment grant of $600 per week was granted within the $2.2 trillion stimulus package, which has now expired. And with the Democrats and Republicans in conflict for the next economic package, the president signs measures to provide extra $400 in weekly unemployment benefits. Workers who have been displaced by the pandemic will be eligible for an additional $400 per week of unemployment benefits under one provision of a series of executive orders that were signed. Inflation will average 0.8% in 2020. It will rise to 1.6% in 2021 and 1.7% in 2022. The core inflation rate strips out volatile gas and food prices. The Fed prefers to use that rate when setting monetary policy. The core inflation rate will average 1% in 2020, 1.5% in 2021, and 1.7% as well in 2022. The core rate well below the Fed's 2% target inflation rate. The U.S. inflation rate history and forecast helps predict the coming year's inflation levels. The GDP growth is likely to continue to shrink in the remainder of 2020, however slowly recover with the years to come in 2021 and 2022. The unemployment rate is likely to continue to be high for the remainder of 2020, but then slowly and gradually decrease in 2021 and 2022. The core inflation is of course going to continue to rise in 2020 and beyond. This is all of course subject to a real recovery occurring, in which case we will be likely seeing a U or a V-shaped recovery, and if not, then an L-shaped recovery that is long and slow, similar to the Great Depression, will be the outcome.
Thank you so much for watching this video. If you do like this video, then please do subscribe as we continue to make more great content for you.